All right, sorry this is late. I actually was almost done recording first version, and then my neighbor's tree fell on my internet cable, or a branch from their tree did, so I had to go over and help them get it off, and it was a whole ordeal. Yeah, not fun. So hopefully that does not happen again. I don't lose power or anything. So yeah, let's get to it. So today we're going to be going over natural law theory and Kantianism, or it's also referred to as deontology. I think natural law theory is a little bit easier to understand. It's pretty simple. So think about the idea that certain actions are natural and therefore right, or others are unnatural and therefore wrong. I'm sure you've heard some people say this or make arguments that sort of said that. Some bad arguments, I'm sure too, like some people they've argued, homosexuality is unnatural and therefore wrong. So it happens all the time. So the idea that morality is natural is sort of associated with natural law theory. I mean, it's in the name. It's often traced back to St. Thomas Aquinas, who's a very big medieval philosopher. Catholics really like him. In fact, a lot of his sort of writings are still doctrine in the Catholic Church. If you take more philosophy classes, you'll read more, or if you've taken philosophy classes, odds are you've read Aquinas. 5 Ways is one that's very popular. So it gets its name from the idea that there are objectively true moral principles that are grounded in human nature, or just the natural order of the universe. So the basic idea is that because there are objectively true facts about human nature that determine what our good consists in, and because moral requirements have to do with maintaining or promoting human goods, these moral requirements are part of the natural order. So obviously Aquinas, he was a theist, so it sort of boils down to God and what God put. There's like a point to certain dispositions to act certain ways. For instance, like your disposition to try to preserve your own life. That sort of leads us to the conclusion that human life is a good thing. So I'll talk about that here in a bit. It is value-based because right action is based on considerations of intrinsic value. So it's similar to consequentialism in this way because it bases right action and derives right action from whether or not an action sort of promotes an intrinsic good, or something that is intrinsically good, or whether it sort of gets in the way of promoting something that's intrinsically good. It is, however, different in that it does not consider the consequences of actions to be important in themselves. It's not necessarily the consequences that are morally relevant. It's sort of the promotion of certain goods. So it's different in that respect. So to understand this theory, we're going to go over the theory of intrinsic value and then its theory of right conduct. The theory of right conduct actually has 2 parts. There's what's called or referred to the core of the theory, which sort of just gives you sort of prohibitions on not infringing on anything that's like intrinsically good. And then there's the doctrine of double effect, which tries to solve some problems with the core theory. Okay, that'll make more sense here in a minute. All right, so here's the theory of intrinsic value. According to Aquinas, there are 4 basic intrinsic goods: human life, human procreation, human knowledge, and human sociability. So the way that we know, or the way that Aquinas understood these things as being intrinsically good, are because we're naturally disposed to do these, to like take actions to get these goods. So for instance, like you naturally have a disposition to preserve your life. You have a natural disposition to procreate, like a sex drive. You have a natural sort of disposition to learn things, and that's because learning things helps you survive. So they are sort of related. And then you sort of are naturally inclined to be social. I will say this is Timmons's version of Aquinas. This is not necessarily Aquinas. Aquinas also had a few other intrinsic goods, namely like to seek God. So like I said, Aquinas is a theist. This is sort of a stripped down version. You can be a natural law theorist without being a theist. So you can be an atheist and be a natural law theorist the same. It would be maybe a little bit different. It's certainly different than Aquinas, but you don't have to be a theist. And that's kind of why I like teaching the Timmons, is because it sort of makes it a little bit more general, because not everybody believes in God. But it still is a viable moral theory. Okay, so each of these four things are of intrinsic value, so they are good in themselves. So promoting these things is going to be the right thing to do, and destroying these things or getting away and the promotion of these things is going to be intrinsically wrong or evil even. Okay, so here's the core of the theory. Just let's take the following principle. We'll call it NLT. An action is right if and only if, in performing the action, one does not directly violate any of the basic values. So killing a human being, with some exceptions that we'll get into later, is morally wrong because it destroys a human life. For instance, like using contraceptives towards human procreation. So it's going to be morally wrong. That's all contraceptives too. I mean, that's sort of part of this theory. It's like anything that gets in the way of human procreation is going to be wrong to do. So that's honestly, that's one of the reasons why the Catholic Church opposes abortion and opposes contraceptives, or historically they have. Interfering with people learning things by distorting information or lying is going to be morally wrong. So let's say you're causing sort of a ruckus in class, that's going to be morally wrong because you're getting in the way of other people learning things. Destroying legitimate social bonds is going to be wrong. So think about somebody spreading rumors, maybe in high school or something like that. That's going to get in the way of human sociability. So that's going to be wrong too. Okay, anything that violates one of those four intrinsic goods or gets in the way of the promotion of them is going to be morally wrong. And that's all well and good. It seems simple, but there are some hard cases that natural law theory, or at least the core of the theory, is going to have a harder time dealing with. So let's consider the following case. So we have a pregnant woman that has cancer in her uterus, and she has to have a hysterectomy to save her life. So human life is an intrinsic good, so the surgery will have a good effect, namely her life will be preserved. But suppose, just for the sake of this example, that a fetus counts as a human life, and the hysterectomy will kill the fetus. So the surgery will also have a bad effect. So she has the option, let's say she has Act 1, get the hysterectomy, save her life, or Act 2, die, not get a hysterectomy and get cancer and die. And depending on the timetable of things or whatever, her and the fetus would die, or she will die and maybe have a fetus, or give birth to a baby, but she'll die. So either the fetus or the woman will die, or both of them will die. And it's sort of unclear from the core of the theory what the right action is. So how would NLT resolve this issue? Remember, we're just talking about the core of the theory. It seems to say that any violation is morally wrong, but this leads us to conclude that both getting the surgery and not getting the surgery are both morally wrong. And that just seems absurd. How can we make sense of this? It's like you do an act, or you do the opposite of the act. You're sort of damned if you do or damned if you don't. So let's look back at the principle and see what we can find to maybe resolve this issue. If you notice, an action is right if and only if, in performing the action, one does not directly violate any of the principles. So I put that in italics. NLT itself only prohibits actions that directly violate one or more of the basic goods. Okay, so now we have to sort of figure out what it means for something to be a direct violation. Okay, It seems possible from that there could be indirect but morally permissible violations. And this leads us to the next component of natural law theory, which is called the doctrine of double effect, which if you're Catholic or went to a Catholic high school or something like that, you may have already heard about. It's a big deal. So here's the doctrine of double effect. So this is sort of in addition to the core principle, and it's named so because it deals with actions that would have at least one good effect and at least one bad effect, where the good and bad deal with the promotion or destruction of the four intrinsic goods. And it's really meant to address the question of whether it is ever morally permissible to bring about bad effects. I shouldn't have used consequences there, but bad effects when bringing about good ones. Okay, so it's meant to help us solve these like harder issues of whether we should act one way or another. Okay, so here is it in a principle form. We'll call it DDE. An action that would bring about at least one evil effect and at least one good effect is morally permissible if and only if the following conditions are satisfied. Okay, and I just want to premise this. You have to satisfy these four conditions. You can't just satisfy three of them. If it doesn't satisfy all four of them, then it's going to be immoral. So first, we have intrinsic permissibility, and that's the action itself is morally permissible. We'll get back into the example in a bit, just to like sort of flesh that out a little bit, but you're not going to be able, for instance, to kill somebody. That's going to be not morally permissible ever. That directly violates one of the intrinsic goods. Okay. Necessity, it is not possible to bring about the good effect except by performing the action that will bring about the bad effect. Okay, so this means basically you have no other option where you can't have the good effect without having the bad effect. Okay, non-intentionality, the evil effect is not intended. This just means it's neither one's chosen end nor a chosen means for bringing about some intended end. And proportionality, the evil brought about by the action is not out of proportion to the good aimed at. Okay, so it needs to be proportional. The good effect needs to either outweigh or be equivalent to the bad effect in one way or another. Okay, so now we're going to look back at that original case, and we're going to see if these four conditions are satisfied. So first, intrinsic permissibility. It seems that's satisfied because having hysterectomy to save your life does not seem intrinsically wrong. So it does get in the way of human procreation, but it's to preserve another intrinsic good. So it's not itself intrinsically wrong to do it. But I do want to say this, it would be wrong if you were getting a hysterectomy just to prevent pregnancy. That would be, on natural law theory, that would be intrinsically wrong. So it's not necessarily the action itself, it's also the reasons why you're doing the action. 2, necessity, having hysterectomy is the only way to save your life. If there were another option, this provision would not be satisfied. So for instance, if there was some chemo treatment or something like that, that odds are would not kill the fetus and save her life, then that seems entirely possible. That would not satisfy this condition. So it sort of has to be your only option. It has to be like a necessary act to preserve one of those intrinsic goods. Third, non-intentionality. This is satisfied because the death of the fetus is a foreseen effect, but not the point of the operation. Okay, so this takes a little bit of unpacking, which is why it has its own slide. So sort of on natural law theory, one intends a consequence when it functions as one, an end, or two, it's one's chosen means for bringing about an end. Okay, so to sort of flesh that out a little bit, let's take the following example. Let's say you're in the woods and you're doing target practice with a rifle to hit a paper target. In doing so, you know the noise will startle some nearby wildlife, but even though you can foresee this happening, it's not the purpose of you firing the rifle. Okay, you're not firing the rifle to scare off wildlife, you're just doing target practice. That's sort of this distinction between a foreseen effect and an intended effect. Okay, your intended effect is just to hit the paper target, but you do foresee that it will have this other effect as well. Okay, so the effect of startling the animals is not something you intend, rather it's just something you foresee. This is a really important distinction in natural law theory because it really helps us get around or navigate some of these more problematic world situations. Fourth, proportionality. This is satisfied because the evil that results from the operation is not out of proportion to the good. So for instance, an innocent life would be destroyed if she has a hysterectomy, but her life is also saved. And just not knowing anything else, it seems like those are proportional. It's one life saved and one life destroyed. So they're at least at balance. So now let's look at the way NLT and DD are related in natural law ethics. The basic idea is that per NLT, we're not supposed to directly violate any of the 4 basic human goods. And DDE just helps us clarify and define what counts as a direct violation. So a direct violation is just going to be one that does not meet those 4 requirements. So keep in mind, like if it doesn't meet one of those, it's not going to be justified. It's not going to be morally permissible. It's going to be prohibited. It has to sort of fulfill all 4 of those. It's necessary and sufficient that it fulfill those 4 requirements. Okay, so we covered consequentialism last class. So let's take a moment to compare these 2 moral theories. An act consequentialist would choose which action would have the best consequences. So, a common theme of consequentialism is good results justify the means. A natural law theorist can't do this. You cannot act in a direct violation of the 4 basic human goods, even if doing so would have great consequences. Okay. So that's a very stark difference between the two theories. Sort of what I said last class, like if you're a consequentialist, there's not going to be any actions that are always prohibited. I mean, you could, kill like this, like not necessarily, but if sort of the utility value of killing somebody is higher than not killing them, then you could be justified in killing somebody. Natural law theorists, you can't do that because that's a violation of human life, one of those intrinsic goods. So you're never going to be able to do that, even if it would have great consequences. So let's return to the trolley problem. When I was making this, I was thinking we were going to be in person. So we're going to go around the room and see what everybody thinks act utilitarians would do, and then what natural law theorists would do. So if you want, just take a minute and consider either one. Just remember with act utilitarians, good consequences are going to justify the means. Natural law theorists, there's going to be no direct violations of the 4 intrinsic goods. Like you're not going to be able to violate any of those 4 intrinsic goods. So here we have the trolley problem. You're sort of standing there and there's a runaway trolley, and you can either flip the switch and change it so that the trolley runs over 1 person, or you can allow the trolley to kill 5 people. So think about that. I'm going to just stop talking for like a few seconds. I'd say go ahead and pause the video because I'm not going to pause that long, and just think about what either one would be justified in doing. Okay, so odds are act utilitarians. Let's say you don't know anything about these people. They're going to flip the switch. That's just odds are there's going to be more utility of 5 people being alive than 1 person being alive. However, natural law theorists, odds are they are not going to be justified in flipping the switch. Flipping the switch would constitute you killing somebody, and that's going to be a direct violation of human life. So you're not going to be justified in doing that. That means you're sort of, the right thing to do is to sit there and, if you only have these 2 options of flip the switch or don't flip the switch, it's going to mean you don't flip the switch, odds are. That's just the way natural law theory works. Okay, so let's talk about applying NLT, natural law theory. So it's pretty basic. There's just 2 steps. Sometimes you only need one of the steps. So first you begin with the core principle and you ask yourself whether any basic goods are violated. If not, the action is not wrong. So it's either it's permissible. If yes, then you move to step 2. And then you figure out if there's a direct violation by applying the doctrine of double effect. If all the 4 provisions are satisfied, the violation is not direct, so it's not going to be wrong. It's pretty simple and clear cut. Okay. So I'm going to finish up just this section just with a few notes and a few problems that people have found with natural law theory. So applying this theory is not really mechanical. So utilitarianism, perfectionism, and egoism, they're like, it's pretty mechanical. You just sort of plug in a factor for utility and then boom, you figure out what the right thing to do is. Everything's kind of defined too. But with natural law theory, at least sort of what I've covered, we have to address questions about interpretations of the four basic human goods. So like knowledge of what, for instance, it says human knowledge is intrinsically good, but I could have knowledge about the number of, blades of grass in my yard. Like I could sit around and learn and get knowledge, that I have, 40,000 blades of grass in my front yard or whatever. But it seems like that knowledge is kind of stupid. It would be a waste of time. I could learn other things and have knowledge of other things that are probably better than that. So that's something to think about. Proportionality, determining when things are out of proportion, requires sensitivity to particular cases and good moral judgment. And it's kind of hard to do that sometimes. I mean, you have to sort of answer questions about, is one human life worth as much as another human life? And if so, that's fine. If you say, well, all people's lives are equally worthwhile, but that's a little problematic because, it's fine if you're willing to say this, but imagine Ted Bundy and Mother Teresa. Let's say, one of them has to die. Odds are you're going to have a very clear idea of who you don't want to be alive anymore. One of those people is probably better than the other person. So that's a question you have to address if you're going to be a natural law theorist. There's also questions about promoting the intrinsic goods. So the way natural law theory works, the reason we know these things are intrinsically good is because we're like naturally disposed to seeking out these things. So for instance, human procreation is good because people naturally have a sex drive. But let's say I choose to like never have children. Does this mean I'm committing a moral wrong because I'm not procreating? Natural law theory says, yeah, I am doing something wrong, even if I'm not, actively having sex or something like that. The fact that I'm not procreating means, it seems like I'm doing something morally wrong by just not doing something, which is a little odd. There's also questions about people who are unable to have children, let's say naturally, and especially people who, let's say their chosen sexual partners, they're unable to have children too. So gay, lesbian couples. There's just these questions that sort of need to be fleshed out, and they seem a little problematic just on the face of it. Another big problem is what's called the is-ought problem. This comes from David Hume. We're probably not going to read any Hume this semester, but you will if you take more philosophy classes. So he argued that it's fallacious to argue that just because something is a certain way, that it means that it ought to be, that it ought to be a certain way. And this is exactly what natural law theory does. So it sort of examines the way things are and then says, well, that's the way things ought to be. And that's, if the is-ought problem is a problem, which it seems like it is, then it's going to be very damning to natural law theory. So for instance, you can examine the nature of human sex drives and conclude that procreation is good, but sex drives also cause or are often used as an excuse for some like very wrong acts like sexual assault. So you have to sort of address this issue if you're going to be a natural law theorist. I will say there was some more contemporary natural law theorists other than Aquinas, but it is not as widely adopted by moral philosophers as sort of the big three or like rights-based ones. It's not as popular today, mainly because of some of these issues, especially Aquinas' theory too. I mean, if you actually dig into Aquinas, like it is theistic, and a lot of contemporary philosophers tried to avoid theistic based arguments for moral philosophy, because they're sort of limited. Okay. So moving on, we're going to move on to Kantianism, Kantian moral theory. It's often called deontology. I don't have this listed. As I was recording the first lecture, it became clear to me that I didn't put this. This is a duty-based moral theory. Okay, so it takes moral duties to be basic. So there's no theory of intrinsic value with deontology or Kantianism. This is starkly different from the rest of the moral theories we've covered, the other two, and some of the other ones that we're going to be looking at, because it takes this notion of duty to be basic, like moral duties. And basically it presupposes that we have moral duties to other people. And it grounds that in terms of rational agency. So other people that are rational, it takes like we have duties to other people to be this basic sort of foundational point. Okay. So most people are familiar with the golden rule. I'm sure you've heard it in kindergarten and throughout school. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. This sort of encapsulates a test for thinking about morality. So you think about being on the receiving end of any action that you're about to do, and you think about that, how you would like it before you do it. And this is great for children. This is great for it works, and it's sort of simplistic, but itself as a moral theory, it doesn't hold up to much scrutiny. For one thing, this is a big issue. It makes the rightness dependent on the desires of an agent, and some agents have some like very weird desires. So you can think about a masochist or somebody like that who likes to get hit. They would be okay with hitting people then, which seems wrong. Or think about like a religious fundamentalist who wants to live sort of an ascetic life, and is okay with being told what to do. That means they can be sort of domineering and paternalistic towards other people, and that seems a little problematic because other people don't want that. So Kantian moral theory is sort of in the spirit of the golden rule, so it attempts to like kind of do a similar thing but avoid the pitfalls of sort of this simplistic sort of notion of just it's just a mantra at this point, and it's good for kids, but it doesn't hold up to much scrutiny as a theory. That's the point. So Immanuel Kant, who was alive to 1724 to 1804, he's super prolific. He wrote about nearly everything. He's one of the greatest philosophers in the Western canon. I mean, super foundational. I could go on and on about his impact on philosophy. So there's something called the modern period of philosophy that started sort of with Rene Descartes and moved through David Hume, Thomas Hobbes. If you ever take sort of a history of philosophy class or an intro class, you'll probably read some of these people, John Locke. That's sort of all is encapsulated in what's called the modern period of philosophy. And the modern period sort of ends with Kant. It's sort of after that, there's sort of this split in Western philosophy known as the analytic and continental distinction. And that sort of comes out after Kant. Kant tried to synthesize and solve a lot of issues. So that being said, he wrote about just about everything, especially metaphysics and epistemology. But he also is very well known for his moral theory. Okay. So essential concept in his moral writings are that moral requirements can be expressed as comments that categorically forbid certain actions. Okay. And they apply regardless of what we want. So that's solving the issue sort of with the golden rule or the consequences of those actions. Often Kantianism is taught as the opposite of consequentialism. And it sort of is. I wouldn't say it's like a polar opposite or anything. It's certainly very different because it does not consider the consequences of actions to be important on making an act right or wrong. They're taught as being opposite. They're not really opposite. They're just very, very different. That's the way I understand it, at least. But he thought that specific moral requirements can be derived from a fundamental moral principle called the categorical imperative. Okay. So we're gonna cover two different formulations. So in the groundwork for metaphysics of morals, I think he had 5, if I remember correctly. We're just going to cover 2 that I think are a little bit more clear. It's also in the Timmins reading. I think you'll be glad if you ever do read the groundwork, you'll be glad, or if you ever just read Kant, it's often better to teach Kant without having to read Kant, especially for intro classes, because it's very difficult to read Kant. It's very rewarding, but it's also like he's one of the harder ones to sort of understand just by reading it, just the way it's translated and the way he writes and stuff like that. And it's super complex. It's a little vague. So a lot of his writings, he was writing continuously throughout his entire life. So it's hard to make sense of the earlier writings in regards to the later writings. And there's just a lot of Kant scholarship right now. There's a lot of people writing dissertations on Kant and publishing papers on Kant. Kant is a very big deal in philosophy. Okay, so this is the first formulation of the categorical imperative that we're going to cover. It's called the humanity formulation. Expressed as a principle, we'll just call it H. It just says that an act is right if and only if the action treats a person, which includes oneself, as an end in themselves and not merely as means. Okay, so obviously we need to know what it means to treat someone as a mere means, but we really don't have time to do this in this class. This is sort of an applied ethics course, and this is mainly just because Kant is very complex and there's still people trying to make sense of it. However, there are some like paradigmatic examples that come from Kant, and through some of these illustrations, I'll try to get you guys to understand sort of what it means strictly. So here are just a few. I mean, deception and coercion are like the 2 paradigmatic examples, like I just said. So there are 2 obvious ways that you can treat someone as a mere means, and this is because you're treating them as an object to be manipulated. So think about like, let's say you want to hang up a painting in your room. Obviously, you're going to need to find a stud and a nail and a hammer. Okay, so what you're doing with a hammer and a nail, and if you have a stud finder or something like that, you're using those as a means to hang up your painting. Like hanging up the painting is the end. Okay, and you're just using these tools to like as a means to attain this end. And a big issue in Kantian moral theory is when you do this with people, and that's because we sort of have duties to other people, and it's kind of complicated, but this is grounded in like rational agency, and all people have dignity, and you're not supposed to use people as objects or tools to be manipulated. Okay, people aren't tools; people are rational agents, and we owe people certain duties. Just in virtue of them being rational agents and being people, basically. There's a minor point. Kant is actually sort of okay with the idea of rational agency not being specific to humans. It seems possible just with Kant's theory, taken as it is, that there could be other rational agents that aren't humans necessarily. So think about like if aliens showed up or something like that, or if there was a really advanced AI. It seems possible that we could also owe those things moral duties, but it's going to be, at least right now, only in regard to people. That's going to be like that's what has dignity, is people, and it's in virtue of their rational agency. Okay, so deceiving somebody in order to get them to do something that they would otherwise not do constitutes using a person as an instrument. Okay, because you're basically lying to somebody to get some end, to attain some end, and you're not respecting their rational agency. Okay, so like that's a very paradigmatic, clear example of what it means to use somebody as a means. You're not trying to convince them to help you or something like that. You are lying to somebody in order to get something like that you want. Okay, coercion, you're doing the same thing. You're manipulating somebody through threats for your own end, and that constitutes using somebody. So think about, if you're in like a labor camp or something like that, and somebody wants you to grow corn, and they'll say, well, I'm going to shoot you if you don't grow this corn. They're using you as a tool to grow corn to attain their own ends, and they're threatening to hurt you if you don't get them to attain this end. Okay, and that's going to be a huge. There's a big prohibition on doing this to people in Kantian moral theory. Okay, so that's sort of hopefully that clears up what it means to not use somebody as merely as a means. But now let's sort of unpack what it means to treat somebody as an end in themselves. Okay, so this is a positive requirement. And so like there's negative requirements and positive requirements sort of in moral philosophy. A negative requirement is just you should not do X. So if I have a negative requirement to not drive on the wrong side of the road, it means I should not drive on the wrong side of the road. A positive requirement is when somebody's required to do something. Okay, so like, let's say I have a positive requirement to drive on the right side of the road. That means I should drive on the right side of the road. Okay, so positive requirements, they get us to do something. Negative requirements, they prevent us from doing something. That's just a very simple way of understanding it. Okay, so for something to be an end in itself, it's just to say that it has special worth or value that demands we have positive regard for them. And Kant refers to this worth as dignity. And all people have it, just in virtue of their rational agency. Okay, so from this, failing to help someone who deserves help is wrong because you fail to have this positive regard for that person's dignity. That's just an example of what it means. But also, like, I mean, lying to somebody also does that too. So hopefully that's a clear example. Please also reach out to me if this is unclear. This is by far the most complicated moral theory we're going to go over. It gets easier after this, I promise. This one is, it gets a little hairy. Okay, so let's talk about applying H to like moral situations. It requires us to consider both requirements. So one, not treating people as a means, and two, treating them as ends in themselves. Interpreting this is sort of the hard part. Excuse me. So what does it really mean to treat someone as merely a means? If I ask someone the time because they have a watch, it seems like I'm treating them as a means, but this doesn't seem as problematic. For one thing, like, I mean, yeah, there are means for me learning what time it is, but I'm not merely treating somebody as a means. So there's sort of a distinction there. I'm not like treating them. It would be different if like I only had a friend because he has a watch and I only hang around this person so I can know what time it is. But just passing somebody on the street and saying, hey, do you have the time? And they look at their phone and they tell me the time. That's not really problematic at all. It's because you're not like only treating somebody as a tool to be used. Okay, so anytime you're treating somebody as a tool to be used, just like you would a hammer or you would a vacuum or something like that, and not as a thing with dignity, that's when you're going to be treating somebody merely as a means. So think about like if you have a rich friend that you only hang around because they have money, you're treating them as only merely as a means to like, get free meals or something like that. And that's going to be morally wrong from this humanity formulation. Okay, so from that, sort of manipulating somebody, like I just said, that is problematic because you're only treating somebody as a tool to be used to attain some end. Okay. So Kant argues that in satisfying this requirement, we're obligated to adopt two goals. This is sort of to help clear things up a little bit. So one, we're supposed to promote the morally permissible ends of others, and two, we're supposed to perfect ourselves. Okay, this is sort of meant to save us from going around and only helping other people. So like that positive requirement to treat somebody as an end in themselves. If you read that sort of at face value, you can find, or you can be led to like believe, okay, well, I need to help people like all the time. Like I need to like, go help people all the time, like, because they're ends in themselves. I have to go around and sort of make myself almost a subject to morality and help other people all the time. And that seems overly demanding. That just seems wrong. Okay, and these two goals are sort of to help with that issue, if that makes any sense. Okay, for one thing, it limits how much, like, what we're supposed to help people do. So there's a famous example by, I can't remember her name. I think it was Barbara Herman, who's a big Kant scholar. She has like an example of you see somebody struggling with a painting, getting it in a van late at night from like a museum, and you go and you help them, get this heavy painting into a van, but it turns out they're an art thief. So you're not going to be obligated to help somebody steal stuff, or obligated to help people manipulate people or lie to people or stuff like that. All right, so it sort of limits that in one sense. And two, we have a goal of self-perfection. So we have sort of an obligation to work on ourselves and make ourselves more moral, for one thing, so develop our moral character, and also just sort of, attain our own sense of perfection. So let's say you're a musician, you're going to have an obligation to like practice, for one thing. So you're not going to just have to run around and help people all the time. You're going to be able to have time for yourself. Okay. These are general goals, but they just give you a degree of latitude in deciding whether to promote the ends of others or your own self-perfection. So you're not like running around all the time obligated to help people. That's sort of a problem with consequentialism, I will say. With consequentialism, anytime you're not doing the act that has the most utility, you're not doing the right thing, technically. So sitting around and watching TV, if you're a utilitarian, if it's promoting your own happiness, that's fine. But if you could be doing something else that promotes more happiness for other people or yourself included, then you're supposed to be doing that thing. You're not supposed to be watching TV or playing video games or stuff like that. In fact, even, let's say let's go back to the musician example. Let's say you play music because it makes you happy. And let's say you really like playing one song because it makes you happy. But if, other people want to hear another song, it would make them more happy, then you're going to be obligated to play those other songs, even though it makes you less happy. Consequentialist theories tend to be very demanding. And Kantianism is meant to be a little less demanding. Okay. That being said, it's all about properly integrating the promotion of well-being for others in one's own self-perfection. It's just supposed to give us a little bit of latitude in what we do, basically. Okay, so that sort of ends the discussion on the humanity formulation. Now we're going to cover what's called the universal law formulation. Keep in mind, I'm going to say this again, Kantianism is a duty-based theory, so there's no theory of intrinsic value. I will ask you about that on an exam, I promise. Some people will miss it, I guarantee it. Don't be that person. There's no theory of intrinsic value with Kant. It's all about duty. Okay. Keep in mind too, both of these formulations are just that. They're different formulations of the same thing, namely the categorical imperative. Kant thought there was only one sort of moral principle, and that was what's called the categorical imperative. Okay. Oops, sorry. I was checking. My lights just flickered off. I was checking to make sure I was still recording. Okay, so this formulation deals explicitly with whether actions are right or wrong. Okay, so it's a little more mechanical than the humanity formulation. They are meant to do the same thing though, just sort of in different ways. So here it is in principle form. We'll call it UL. An action is right if and only if one can both A, consistently conceive of everyone adopting and acting on the general policy, which is called the maxim of one's action, and also B, consistently will that everyone act on that maxim. Okay, so this is similar to the golden rule, but it doesn't really refer to an agent's desires, but it's sort of meant to do, it's in the spirit of the golden rule. That's the way I'll teach it. So let's talk about maxims. Per Kant, whenever we act on a maxim. So thinking about a maxim is like a general policy that you can derive from an action. So for instance, imagine me going to McDonald's because I'm hungry and I only have like $6. We can derive the maxim whenever I'm low on money and I'm hungry, I'll go get fast food. Okay, it's like a general policy. That's just like a very simple example. So with this formulation of the categorical imperative, you formulate the maxim, and then you ask yourself, can I conceive of and will that everyone act on this same policy? So going back to the example, it's like, can I imagine that, everyone, whenever they're hungry and they only have a little bit of money, going and getting fast food? Sure. It seems like I can imagine that. Can I will that everyone act on that same policy? Sure. Like whenever, they sort of fulfill these two conditions, they go and get fast food. It seems fine. It seems like that would pass the universal law formulation. So if you can do that, if you can do both of those things, then the action is going to be right. And if you can't, the action is going to be morally wrong. It's a two-part test, so let's consider some more complicated applications. All right, a lying promise. This is just a promise that somebody makes that they have no intention of keeping. So take the following example. You really need some money. Let's say you blew all your money at the casino over the weekend or something like that. And the only way to get it is to get a loan where you promise to repay it, but you have no intention of doing so. Let's say you go to your friend and you're like, hey, I need $300 for food and rent this week. And you're like, I'll pay you back once I get my paycheck, but you have no intention of doing that. I'm sure people have done this to you, had it done to me. That's why I don't loan money anymore. I'm a little jaded because of it. All right, so the following maxim would underlie that action. Let's call it M1. Whenever I need money, I can get it only by making a lying promise. I will borrow the money by making a lying promise. Okay, you're not really borrowing the money. You're sort of taking the money by making a lying promise. Okay, so that's M1. Then ask yourself if you can consistently will and conceive that everyone acts on M1 in such circumstances. So every time someone needs money and they can only get it by lying, they do. You imagine everybody in the world doing that. Whenever they need money and can get it only by lying, that's how they get money, okay? So this does not pass what the part one, the conceivability test, because you can't imagine a world in which everyone in need of money successfully makes a lying promise. And the reason for that is because the reason that a lying promise works is because in general, people tend to keep their promises. So you make a promise to repay somebody, most people will repay somebody. That's why promising works, because people trust one another. But if you imagine a world where everybody lies, to get money and not pay it back, you can't conceive of a world the world at least being the same as it is, because the institution of promising would break down. Nobody would get any loans whatsoever because nobody would trust one another to repay their loans. So that means it doesn't pass the conceivability test. You can't imagine a world where promising is still around if everybody were to do this. All right, you would not be able to do the act at all. Okay. So think about this sort of as like taking advantage of people. You're almost free riding. So that's a thing in like political philosophy and when moral philosophy, for an instance, you're sort of free riding on other people keeping their promises. And the only reason that you would be able to get away with not keeping your promise is because everybody else sort of, or at least most people, they keep their promises. Okay. So that's how I try to understand it. Okay. So if you can't consistently conceive of a world where everybody acts on the proposed maxim, then it fails the first test. All right. So yeah, boom, immoral. Making a lying promise is immoral. That's just a very clear example. It fails the first part. It's morally wrong to make lying promises. Okay. If everyone did it, you would be unable to do it. So it's inconsistent. And that's the consistency part. You would be unable to do it if you would be unable to do this act if everybody else did that act. That means you're sort of taking advantage of other people. So it's like the thought behind it. If you're acting on a maxim that doesn't pass the test, then you're making an exception for yourself and therefore are not respecting others because you're taking advantage of them. Okay. And you're not just taking advantage of the person that you're getting the loan from and you're not repaying, you're taking advantage of everybody that keeps their promises because you're sort of skirting by on not keeping your promise because other people trust you to keep their promises because most people keep their promises. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now let's go to clause B. I'm just going to read clause B. Consistently will that everyone act on the maxim. Okay, so think of will. It's almost synonymous with wanting. It's a little different. It's a little unclear exactly what it means, but you know, I think it's pretty understandable generally what it means. Okay, so clause B deals with a different issue. So I'm going to illustrate this just with another example. So like, let's suppose that you can help someone in need, but you would rather not bother to help. So let's say somebody's like, you know, lifting a really heavy box up a flight of stairs on campus, and you know, you're not doing anything else. You can obviously help them. They're really struggling, and the only reason you don't help them is because you don't feel like it. So from that act of not helping, you'd be acting on the following maxim. So we can derive the following maxim from that actions. Whenever I'm able to help others in need, I will refrain from helping. So this is, you know, whenever, that means everywhere and always. So think about it, it's like every time I see somebody in help that I could help, and everywhere I go that I see this, and I can help them, I'm still not going to help. So imagine that's the maxim that you derive from that actions. Okay. So this probably passes the conceivability test. You can imagine a world where no one helps others that are in need. It would be kind of an unpleasant one, but it's not inconsistent to imagine such a world. It's definitely possible. But you have to sort of ask yourself, do you will that everyone adopt and act on this maxim? Okay, so if you do will that, you're also willing that others refuse to help you when you're in need. Okay, but this is inconsistent with the fact that as rational agents, we embrace the following maxim, RM, I will that others who are able to help me do so when I'm in need. This is just sort of an implicit, you know, desire or something that we all need. This is it's sort of built into the way we are as people. So think about like I think it's RM is the rational maxim. Everybody wants this. It would I mean somebody can say, well, I don't want help even when I need it. You can imagine somebody saying that, but that's kind of dumb, to be honest. So imagine, I mean, I can't imagine not wanting to help when I actually need help. So let's say I'm struggling to carry a box up some stairs. I definitely would want help if I actually need it. Think about your car breaks down on the side of the road and you don't have the tools to fix it. You definitely want somebody else to help you. Okay, so just I think it's right that all of us sort of as rational agents, we all embrace this maxim. It would be kind of crazy to say, no, I don't want help when I actually need help. That's kind of crazy. No, nobody would be like that, I don't think. Okay, so keep in mind we have RM here, and then we have M2. All right, but the implication of willing that everyone adopt and act on M2 would be, I am. I will that others who are able to help me refuse to do so when I'm in need. So if you notice, RM is inconsistent with I am, and I am is an implication of willing that everyone adopt and act on M2. All this means is that we cannot consistently will that everyone adopt and act on M2. Okay, and because of this, it violates the second part of UL. So the action, remember, the action of not helping others when you could is going to be immoral too. All right. That is a little complicated. I understand. I know it may be a little unclear to you, just the way that I've presented it. Please email me or set up a meeting with me, and we can figure out. We can go over some more examples and stuff like that, and I'll help you understand it. Also, probably next class we'll just cover this again really briefly, and run through some more examples. Okay, but that being said, if you can't consistently will, even if it passes the first test, if you can't consistently will that everybody act on that maxim, the action is also going to be immoral. Okay. So what are the point of these two tests? They're really supposed to, and they're designed to distinguish between a narrow and a wide duty. So remember, Kantianism It is a duty-based moral theory. It's not value-based. All right, so duties are basic, and they're sort of the foundation of morality, of the moral theory, I meant to say. So maxims that one cannot consistently conceive as adopted and acted on by everyone are actions that are contrary to a narrow duty. So that's like the first part. And maxims that can be conceived of but cannot be consistently willed are going to be against wide duties. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that on this slide. So the realm of narrow duties, this is just a distinction. It's made in moral philosophy generally, not just Kantianism. Narrow duties are actions which one has little room for on how they're applied. So think about like making a promise to your friend to meet them, on Friday afternoon for cocktails or something like that. You generate, by making like a specific promise like that, a narrow duty to show up at that time and to meet your friend at a certain place. It's because you promised, and you owe it to them because you made that promise. Okay, the realm of wide duties, there's a little bit more wiggle room for fulfilling that duty. So think about like duty to give to charity. There's a lot of charities around, and if you just have a duty to give to charity, you could pick between St. Jude or Doctors Without Borders or any number of charity. Okay, as long as you can sort of pick which charity you want to give to. Okay, and just as another note, keep in mind, it's not the consequences of actions that do the work here. It's all about the consistency of the willing. The regard for consequences does not have anything to do with it. All right. All right, so now let's talk about applying UL, just basic steps. Step one, you formulate the maxim on which you're proposing to act. So you sort of derive the maxim from the act that you're about to do or considering doing. You consider the possibility of everyone in similar circumstances adopting and acting on that maxim. So can you conceive of the world? This is test A. And if it doesn't pass test A, then it's going to be a violation of a narrow duty, and it's going to be immoral. And if you can, then you can ask yourself if you can consistently will that everyone adopt and act on that maxim. And if you can't, then it's going to be a violation of a wide duty, such as refusing to help others. And if yes, or if it does pass this, then it's a morally right action. Okay. Hopefully that made sense. Basically, there's just these two tests, and for an action to be morally right, you're going to have to be able to pass both of these tests. All right, so here are just a few notes, just closing comments on Kantianism. The hard part, especially with the UL formulation, is correctly formulating one's maxim and thinking through the two consistency tests. I'm sorry, there's a typo there. Also keep in mind, UL and H are formulations of the same principle. They do the same thing in different ways. For instance, if you can't consistently conceive or will that a maxim be adopted by everyone, then you're going to be making an exception for yourself and thereby either treating someone as a means or failing to treat them as an end in themselves. You're supposed to be able to run and act through both of these tests and sort of get the same sort of verdict from both of them. Also, sort of on that first point, on formulating one's maxim and thinking through the two consistency tests, this is sort of a critique of Kantianism. I don't know if it's a critique, but it is an issue on that this is kind of hard to do on the spot. So imagine you're in a trolley problem and you're like trying to like figure out what to do, and you're like, oh, okay, can I conceive of a world where everybody flips the switch when they could save 5 lives over 1? It's like, yes, I can. Can I consistently will it? It's like, okay, yeah, I can do that too. So I'll flip the switch and I'll save the 5 people. That takes a lot of time, obviously, and that's sort of that would be kind of draining if you're in a rush to make a moral decision. But some Kant scholars are like, well, you're not supposed to really do this in real time. You're supposed to like sort of run through possible actions sort of on the front end and like sort of figure out generally what maxims are going to be morally right and which ones are going to be morally wrong. And from that, you sort of like have a bank, or you preload like a bunch of moral verdicts so you can actually act in real time. So there is sort of a solution to that. I mean, that's one possible solution to this problem, at least. So here are some other issues. There is no regard to the consequences of actions as making those actions right or wrong. It all boils down to the willing. So sometimes you can probably think of a few circumstances where an act would have very good consequences, but it doesn't pass either the conceivability or the consistent willing test. This is sort of an issue sometimes because we do tend to consider the actions of or consider the consequences of actions as mattering. And with Kantianism, it just doesn't matter. It does not matter about the consequences at all. There's no regard to the consequences of actions. Okay, and this can get us in some weird scenarios sometimes. There are possible solutions if you're interested. So like there's sort of a famous critique. It's like the murderer at the door. It's like, you know, your friend is running from a murderer and they come to you for help and they're like, hey, can you hide me? There's a murderer after me. And then this guy comes up to your door and he's like, hey, have you seen your friend Sam? And it seems like with Kantianism, you're obligated to tell the truth of this and say, yeah, I did see Sam and he's hiding, you know, in my spare bedroom. There is some solutions to this critique, I think. So for one thing, it depends on the maxim that you're acting on. So making a blind promise versus lying to save somebody's life, those would have different maxims. So in the first case, you're lying in order to you're lying in order for personal advantage. In the second case, the maxim would be, well, I'm lying to save somebody's life. So the maxim would be, well, you know, every time somebody is in a position to save somebody's life by lying, they do. It seems that the institution of telling the truth wouldn't be harmed by that as much because most people are not put in the situation where they have to lie to save somebody's life. So there is a possible solution to this problem, but if you do more moral philosophy, you'll definitely encounter that objection to Kantianism. It's problematic a little bit, but I'm just going to say that is one possible solution. Another issue is very abstract. This is a pretty complicated moral theory. Kant is very, very hard to understand. I mean, there's still, I mean, a huge field of just Kant scholarship. Pretty much every major philosophy department, every university has a Kant scholar or somebody that does work on Kant. It's very hard to understand Kant. You honestly have to also know German, which is hard too. So that's why some people are sort of scared away by Kant. There's also, this is another critique, there's very little room for developing moral theories towards animals. So if you're sort of an animal rights activist or you care about, you know, not mistreating animals, Kantianism is not going to help you at all. There are some Kant scholars that try to do this, but it hasn't worked. So H, the humanity formulation obviously does not apply because animals are not people. They're not rational in the same sense that people are. And it seems that some very bad treatment of animals could pass the consistency and conceivability tests. So like, let's say you want, you know, cheaper meat for people. You can consistently will that you know, give antibiotics to animals and give them less room to like roam around and you know, be free. You can consistently will, or I mean, you can consistently like imagine that world. You can conceive of that world. I'm sorry. And it seems like you can consistently will that. So if you care about animals, Kantianism is probably not the best moral theory to adopt. Okay, so that closes out our lecture for today. Please reach out for me if you have any questions. I'm going to post a quiz pretty soon. Again, I'm sorry that it took a minute. It was it's this ice storm. Like I said, my internet just went out in the middle of me recording this, and I'm recording it on Zoom, so it just it crashed the whole thing, and I was almost done. I was like on the second to last slide, so I got a little upset. Then I had to go and help clear off a branch from an internet cable, which was a lot of fun. So hopefully I'll see you all next week. There will be a quiz. It'll be due Sunday at 5 p.m. So please do that, and have a good weekend.